Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to take you on a bit of a power trip, a deep dive into how CEOs can become absolute rock stars using, of all things, the 80-20 rule.
I know.
Yeah.
Sounds a little dry. But trust me, this isn't your typical business school lecture. We're working from a real-world document. That lays out how this principle works in the high-stakes world of running a company. And let me tell you, it's got some seriously surprising insights.
You know, we often hear about CEOs making these big sweeping decisions. But what's fascinating is that the 80-20 rule suggests that real effectiveness comes from pinpointing those few key levers that truly drive the business forward.
Okay, so for anyone who needs a quick reminder, the 80-20 rule, or Pareto principle, is all about that magical imbalance. 80% of your results come from just 20% of your efforts. But how does that translate to a CEO who's got their hands in everything?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The source material breaks down 8 key areas where CEOs can really maximize their impact using this principle. And the first one, where it all starts, is vision and strategy, right? Vision and strategy. That's not just some fluffy corporate jargon, is it? You might think of vision as this massive long-term plan. But I'm curious, how does the 80-20 mindset apply here?
It's about focusing on the core. Imagine you're a CEO, and you can only choose a handful of core values or beliefs that would drive 80% of your company's future success. What would those be? That's where the real power lies, in identifying those vital few elements that will guide everything else.
It's like distilling your company's DNA down to its most potent elements. So a CEO with clear 80-20 vision isn't just thinking of the next quarter, they're laser focused on those fundamental drivers. That will shape the company for years to come.
Absolutely. And speaking of shaping the company, the next area where this principle really comes into play is leadership and talent management.
Leadership. We've all had those bosses who seem to do everything right, and maybe some who've left us scratching our heads. But how does a CEO approach leadership through this 80-20 lens? Do they spend 80% of their time mentoring their top 20% performers?
That's an interesting approach. And there's definitely something to be said for focusing on high-potential individuals. But the 80-20 principle in leadership might also be about identifying those key cultural levers. Maybe it's establishing a specific communication style, or fostering a particular decision-making process. That will have the biggest impact on the overall team dynamics.
So it's not just about individual coaching, but about creating a system where, even with limited time, a CEO can maximize their impact on the company's culture and the way people work together.
Exactly. And that culture of effectiveness then trickles down into every other area, including, of course, the financial side of things.
Which brings us to our next topic, financial oversight and performance. I'll admit, this one sounds a bit intimidating, but I'm guessing it's not just about number crunching all day.
Not at all. Remember, we're talking about the 80-20 CEO. It's about identifying those key financial metrics. Maybe it's cash flow, customer acquisition cost, or gross profit margin. That give you the truest pulse of the business.
So instead of getting bogged down in every single detail, you're saying CEOs should be asking, what are the vital few financial indicators that tell me if we're truly winning or losing?
Exactly. Think of it like a pilot checking their instruments. They don't need to monitor every gauge constantly, just the vital few. That will tell them if they're on course.
Makes sense. So we've got a clear vision, strong leadership, and a laser focus on the right financial indicators. What comes next?
This is where things get really interesting, because now we're talking about customer and market focus. In today's world, if you're not obsessed with your customers, you're probably not going to be in business very long.
That customer-centric approach is everywhere now, but I'm guessing the 80-20 CEO doesn't just try to please everyone equally.
Right. Think of a company like Amazon. They've built an empire by understanding their customers better than anyone. But they didn't get there by trying to be everything to everyone. Instead, they've consistently focused on delivering exceptional value to specific customer segments, like Prime members. And that's been a key driver of their success.
So the 80-20 CEO might ask, what are the 20% of customers who drive 80% of our revenue? What do they really value? And how can we deliver that value better than anyone else?
Exactly. It's about making strategic choices and focusing your resources where they'll have the biggest impact. And that same principle applies to staying ahead of the curve in today's rapidly evolving technological landscape.
Which takes us to innovation and technology. This is where I really get excited. The pace of change is just mind-blowing. CEOs have to be on top of trends and constantly thinking about how to leverage new tech, right?
It's not just about keeping up with the latest gadgets, though. An 80-20 CEO understands that real innovation comes from fostering a culture where experimentation and creativity thrive.
So how do they do that? Do they give everyone free rein to work on whatever they want?
It's about finding the sweet spot. Think of a company like Google. They encourage their employees to spend 20% of their time on their own projects. That kind of freedom to explore and experiment is where their most groundbreaking ideas come from.
That's incredible. So it's not just about the CEO being innovative themselves. It's about creating an environment where innovation can flourish throughout the organization.
Precisely. And that same principle of identifying and nurturing the vital few applies to managing risk, which is unfortunately a reality for any CEO.
Which leads us to risk management and compliance. This one sounds a bit heavy, but I'm guessing it's not just about avoiding lawsuits or scandals, though that's certainly important.
It's much bigger than that. Think about it this way. An 80/20 CEO understands that managing risk effectively is about building trust. Trust with your customers,
Yeah.
your investors, and the public.
It's like that old saying, it takes years to build trust and only seconds to destroy it. So how does a CEO apply the 80/20 rule to something as complex as risk management? Do they focus on the 20% of risks that are most likely to occur?
That's a great question. And the answer is it depends. Sometimes it might be about identifying the small number of high-impact risks that, if they were to occur,
Yeah.
could cripple the company. But in other cases, it might be about focusing on the systems and processes that can mitigate the vast majority of potential risks.
So it's a bit of a balancing act, understanding both the high impact risks and the systemic safeguards that can prevent most problems from ever arising.
Exactly. And speaking of balancing acts, the next area we're going to explore is all about how CEOs navigate the often complex world of external relationships.
Which brings us to external relationships and networking. This is where those CEO personalities really shine, right? I'm picturing those power lunches and industry conferences. But how does the 80/20 rule apply here? Is it all about rubbing elbows with the top 20% most influential people?
There's definitely an element of strategic networking involved, but an 80/20 CEO understands that it's not just about collecting business cards or attending every event. It's about cultivating deep, meaningful relationships with a select group of individuals who can truly move the needle for the company.
So it's more about quality over quantity when it comes to building those connections.
Precisely. It's about identifying those key stakeholders. Maybe it's a handful of influential investors, a few strategic partners, or even a couple of key mentors, and investing the time and energy to build strong, authentic relationships with them.
It sounds like this is where that personal touch really comes into play. It's not just about transactions. It's about building trust and rapport.
Exactly. And that trust can pay off in dividends down the line, whether it's accessing valuable insights, opening doors to new opportunities, or simply having a network of trusted advisors to lean on when the going gets tough.
It makes you wonder, do those CEOs with the biggest networks always have the most success? Or is it more about the quality of those connections?
That's a great question, and one that researchers are still exploring. But anecdotally, we often see that the most effective CEOs are masters at building and leveraging their networks.
So it's not just about being a social butterfly. It's about being strategic and intentional about who you connect with and how you nurture those relationships. Makes sense. Okay, we've covered 7 of the 8 areas where CEOs can apply the 80/20 principle. What's the final piece of the puzzle?
The 8th area, and it's a crucial one, is corporate governance and legal responsibilities. This is where things can get a bit tricky. But an 80/20 CEO understands that strong governance isn't just about compliance. It's about building a foundation of ethical and responsible leadership.
I imagine in today's world with so much scrutiny on corporate behavior, this area is more important than ever. But how does a CEO apply the 80/20 rule here? Is it about focusing on the 20% of regulations that are most likely to cause problems?
That's part of it, certainly, but it's also about identifying those core principles. Maybe it's transparency, accountability, or fairness. That will guide every decision the company makes.
So it's about establishing a set of non-negotiables, those ethical guidelines that serve as the foundation for everything else.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where doing the right thing isn't just a slogan. It's woven into the very fabric of the organization.
That sounds idealistic, but also incredibly important, especially when you consider those high-profile cases where companies have faced serious consequences for ethical lapses.
Absolutely. Those scandals serve as stark reminders that strong corporate governance isn't just good for business. It's essential for long-term sustainability and maintaining public trust.
So we've covered all 8 areas where CEOs can apply the 80/20 rule: vision and strategy leadership and talent management, financial oversight, customer focus, innovation risk management, external relationships, and corporate governance. It's a lot to take in. but the core message seems to be about focusing on those high-impact activities, those 20% efforts that drive 80% of the results.
Precisely. And it's not just about working harder, it's about working smarter. It's about making strategic choices, setting clear priorities, and focusing your energy where it matters most.
You know, it's interesting. We've been talking about this in the context of CEOs, but it seems like these principles could apply to anyone, regardless of their role or industry.
Absolutely. The 80-20 rule is a universal principle that can be applied to any area of life where you're trying to achieve greater efficiency and effectiveness. Whether you're a student trying to optimize your study habits, an athlete looking to improve their performance, or simply someone who wants to get more done in less time, the 80-20 mindset can be incredibly powerful.
I love that. It's like a secret weapon for anyone who wants to maximize their impact. But how do you actually put this into practice? I mean, it's one thing to understand the concept, but it's another thing entirely to actually identify those 20% activities and make sure you're focusing on them.
That's where the real work comes in, and it's a process that requires self-awareness, honesty, and a willingness to experiment. But the rewards can be significant. Imagine being able to achieve 80% of your desired results by focusing on just 20% of your efforts. That's the power of the 80-20 principle.
It sounds almost too good to be true, but I guess that's the beauty of it. It's not about some magic formula. It's about understanding the inherent imbalance in the world and leveraging that to your advantage.
Exactly. And it's a journey, not a destination. As your goals evolve, so too will your 20%. The key is to stay curious, keep experimenting, and always be on the lookout for those high-impact activities that will drive the most meaningful results.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners today? What's the one thing they should remember from this deep dive into the 80-20 CEO?
If there's one thing to remember, it's this. Don't get caught up in the whirlwind of busyness. Step back, assess your priorities, and ask yourself, what are the 20% of activities that will drive 80% of the results I'm seeking? Once you identify those key levers, focus your time, energy, and resources on them relentlessly. That's the secret to achieving extraordinary results, whether you're a CEO or anyone else striving for excellence.
It's almost like a superpower, isn't it? This ability to cut through the noise and focus on what truly matters. I have to admit, I'm already starting to think about my own 20%.
It's a game changer once you start seeing the world through that lens.
Absolutely. It's not about doing less. It's about achieving more with the time and energy you have. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 80-20 CEO, I'm curious, what's one piece of advice you would give to listeners who are ready to start applying these principles in their own lives?
Don't overthink it. The beauty of the 80-20 rule is its simplicity. Start by identifying one area where you feel overwhelmed or spread too thin. Then ask yourself, what are the few key activities within this area that are driving the majority of my results? Once you have a hypothesis, test it. Delegate, eliminate, or streamline the rest. You might be surprised by how much you can achieve by focusing on just that vital few.
That's great advice. It's about taking action, experimenting, and seeing what works. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's about finding what works best for you.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to adjust course along the way. Your 20% will likely evolve as you gain experience and learn more about yourself and your work.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new toolkit for tackling my to-do list, and I'm willing to bet our listeners are feeling the same way. So to everyone out there who's ready to embrace the power of the 80-20 rule, I say this: go forth and conquer your 20%. And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking those big questions. I